And welcome to our first session here at the hear me. Just to, in case you don't, please know that there's a discuss tab on the side, and that can drop any questions or any technical difficulties with any of the speakers. We'll drop that on the side. But thank you for joining. My name is Wijenayake. I'm a program and communications manager here at SLYCAN Trust, and I would like to warmly welcome all of you all for our session on human mobility under the UNFCCC Process Interventions for Policy and Actions. We have a small panel with us today who will be presenting, will be making their presentations, and will be also open for questions. And I would also like to encourage everyone here to also join in on the discussion via question and answers. So under the discuss panel, there's a Q&A where you could drop any questions that you may have for the speakers. And also, if you would like to contribute, there should be a raise hand option, and we should be able to unmute to that. So with having said that, I would like to welcome you once again, and thank you for joining. We'll start off this session with our first speaker. She's from the Environment and Climate Change Division at the International Organization for Migration, Ms. Sinziana Puscas. I'm so sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, but thank you and welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And you pronounced my name perfectly, so no worries there. I'm going to share the presentation here. Can you let me know if you can see it all right?
Yeah, just give me a minute. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and congratulations to the organizers for this event, and thank you for inviting the International Organization for Migration to speak today. I'm Sinziana Puscas. I'm a project officer in the Migration, Environment and Climate Change Division in IOM. And I want to perhaps take a few minutes to speak about environmental migration, what we are doing about it, and how does environmental migration and climate migration fit into the UNFCCC negotiations or the climate change negotiations. Normally when I do a presentation, I would like to know the audience. So maybe we can start with a bit of an interactive exercise. And I was just wondering if people maybe can unmute themselves and give me an example of environmental migration that maybe you've seen on TV or in your work. Do you know of any climate migration example, disaster displacement example?
Yeah, sorry, I just want to maybe quickly come in with a logistics check. So there's two ways in which this can be done. You could either opt to type in whatever that you would want to say in the discuss tab, which is on the side, on the left-hand side of your screen, or there should be a raised hand option for those who are in the audience. And once you would raise your hand, we will be able to mute you. I think Amira has also explained the same on the discuss panel. So.
Great, thank you. So anyone wants to share an example of environmental migration, either in the discuss box or if they want to speak? I will give you a few minutes about this, and no worries if you don't have any examples. I can share some from my side as well. But looking at the audience, I'm pretty sure the audience knows a few examples, so don't be shy.
I'm wondering, since our audience is probably warming up to the panel, why not you maybe just share some and the others could
Perfect,
also.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so a very eloquent example is always the country of Bangladesh. We hear a lot about Bangladesh in the news. And in the photo, you can see one of the communities that have been affected by river erosion and that have been displaced multiple times because of it. We also hear a lot about the hurricane season in the Caribbean, for example. We've seen multiple hurricanes devastate and displace thousands of people in this area. And also in the Caribbean, we see earthquakes as well. If we remember the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that displaced some 2.3 million people. And of course, we cannot talk about environmental migration without talking about the Pacific. And in the photo, you can see a low-lying atoll of Kiribati. And in this area, a lot of people are threatened by sea level rise. And as flooding becomes more and more common, some of the last resort options are, of course, planned relocation or seasonal migration. So these are just a few examples to show you the variety of environmental migration, and also to show you that there are multiple drivers to it. There is no internationally agreed definition of environmental migration. And with this vacuum, IOM had to propose an environmental migration definition because we have been working on this topic for almost 30 years now. So we had to call something the work that we do. On the screen, you can see the definition for environmental migration that IOM proposes. And as you will see, it's quite broad. And this is on purpose. We want to be able to account for all types of movements that happen due to the environment. So when we talk about the migration part of this nexus, what do we mean? As you have seen from the examples, environmental migration can be forced, right? Like when a hurricane hits and there's no other solution than just moving in a forced way because you have to find a bed for the night. But it can also be voluntary migration. So when we see labor mobility in the context of climate change adaptation, like in Pacific Islands. Can also see migration of proximity, so just moving to the next village, or of long distance migration, like we see, for example, in the Sahel area, of people moving to Europe. We also talk about temporary or permanent migration. Temporary, talking perhaps just being in an evacuation center following a disaster for a few weeks or months sometimes, or more permanent migration, like in the case of disappearing islands in the Pacific, the question of statelessness and permanently relocating people to other places. So when we see this variety and typology of migration, we do ask ourselves, is environmental migration then a problem or is it a solution? And in IOM, we like to say that it's both. It is a problem when environmental migration puts people into very vulnerable situations, like following displacement or protracted displacement. But it can also be a solution if this is the only way to adapt to the changing environment around us. Talking about the environment, let's look at the drivers of this type of migration. And we like to talk about two types of environmental drivers. We have environmental events, which can be sudden onset events, so things that develop over a few days, or slow onset events, things that take a few weeks or months to develop. And we like to talk about natural hazards. And there's different typologies of natural hazards, but you can see a few examples here. We have geophysical hazards, such as earthquakes or tsunamis. We have hydrological ones, such as flooding or avalanche. Meteorological ones, such as hurricanes, typhoons, tropical storms. And climatological ones, such as extreme heat or drought. And then on another note, we talk about environmental change. And these are slow onset processes, things that take decades to develop, things that are very long and with a huge impact. And these are things like sea level rise, like we've seen, for example, in the Pacific, desertification, land degradation, like we see a lot now in the Sahel area. And of course, the adverse effects of climate change that impact almost all the processes that I mentioned before. And of course, when these slow onset processes reach a tipping point, they can develop into environmental events or disasters. In terms of some facts and figures about environmental migration, we know that between 2008 and 2019, there were some 288.5 million people newly displaced within their country, so internal displacement, due to sudden onset disasters. You see there's some variation across the years, but in general, this displacement is way higher than conflict-related displacement. In 2018, for example, the disaster displacement was 3 times higher than conflict displacement. And already these numbers are very high, but they do not account for all movement in the context of the environment and climate change. We know these numbers that talk about sudden onset disasters, but we do not know the number of people moving in the context of slow onset events and processes. Remember from the environmental drivers, the 2 differences. So we think there are even more people moving in the context of the environment and climate change. What we do know, though, is that environmental drivers rarely have a sole effect on mobility. They interact with economic drivers, political, demographic, or social drivers of migration. We also know that the majority of people that are displaced in the context of disasters remain within their country and their region. So it's very rare that we see the movement across between different regions. We also know that there's a few areas that are most vulnerable and where their populations are most affected, such as the least developed countries, such as small island developing states in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America. And if you want more information, you can look on these facts and figures. You can look in the Atlas of Environmental Migration that we developed in 2017. Now, what are we doing about it, and who is doing it? The main actors that try to address environmental migration are, of course, states. This is whenever we talk about migration, it is a sole responsibility of states or a primary responsibility of states. And then, of course, climate change has to be done in a collaborative manner among states as well. So they'll work at different levels as well, national, regional, and global. Then we also have the United Nations, the agencies of the United Nations, with IOM, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, who is addressing this topic. We also have hybrid actors, such as the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is a mix between states and the UN. Of course, we have the civil society, which is very strongly advocating for solutions and implementing solutions for this. We have a lot of civil society coming from human rights angles, from climate action angles, from migration angles, trying to address this. There are universities and academia who are doing a lot of quality research for better and more data and evidence on this topic. And of course, migrants themselves, as integrated into all the other actors I mentioned before. They are at the center of action on this. Now, what do we mean when we talk about action on environmental migration? The operational approach to address environmental migration is mostly put into these 3 pillars. So first, we have solutions for people to be able to stay in their homes. And this is in order to avert forced forms of migration, so averting displacement, for example. And these are measures such as disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation and mitigation, community stabilization, or resilience building. Then we have another group of actions for solutions for people to move, so when that is the only option. And this is in order to minimize forced forms of displacement or forced forms of migration or displacement. These are measures such as ensuring migration pathways, for example, free movement protocols or labor schemes or transhumance agreements. And of course, then we also have planned relocation as a last resort. And the third group of actions is solutions for people on the move, when the movement, the migration, or the displacement has already happened. And this is to address these types of movements. Measures can include humanitarian aid, of course, contingency planning, so emergency preparedness actions. We also have migration measures such as granting and expediting visas or waiving visas for people in the context of disasters when they have to move across borders. And we also have migration policies of non-return or reintegration strategies for people affected by disasters. There's also action at the policy level. So that was operational level, and now at the policy level. And as you can see, I put a few logos on the slide to show some of the main policy areas that deal with environmental migration, but there are many more. In a mapping that IOM has done in 2018, we counted over 28 policy areas that deal with environmental migration. But of course, at the center of policy action on environmental migration is the Global Compact for Migration and the work around it for its implementation, and the work in the climate change negotiations of the UNFCCC work. And just to go a bit more into details on this, what happens in the climate change negotiations, or what happened so far in terms of environmental and climate migration. We have this visual, and it can be quite overwhelming. And we started this visual in 2015 with Paris, and every year we try to add another logo, so we try to squeeze everything into this slide. And because there's so much work going on, and I think we don't have to read the whole slide, but it's interesting to see the evolution of the topic of migration in the climate change negotiations. You know, we started with COP16 with the first formal acknowledgement of human mobility, including migration, displacement, and planned relocation into the Cancun Adaptation Framework. Then another milestone was in 2015 with the adoption of the Paris Agreement, which includes migration in its preamble, and when the Task Force on Displacement was established under the Warsaw International Mechanism. And now more recently, we look at the implementation of the Task Force on Displacement mandate, the recommendations that it put forward, and that parties to the UNFCCC welcomed at the 24th Climate Change Conference in Katowice. And more recently at COP25, where the Task Force on Displacement launched its second mandate. Of course, there are many different actors working on this, and many different milestones. This work didn't start with COP16; it started way before, of course. And even since COP16, there's quite a few years. So we can see that it has been a long road to arrive at such a rich discussion on human mobility and climate change in the context of the climate change negotiations. And IOM has had a crucial role. IOM has been involved in this since 2007. We have counted so many numerous submissions to UNFCCC on this topic. Now, just maybe to focus a bit on COP24 and the Katowice decision, this is where we've seen the recommendations of the Task Force on Displacement come to fruit and to be endorsed by the parties to UNFCCC. These recommendations are very strong. They talk about integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of climate change. And we put together 10 key takeaways from these recommendations in IOM, and we're not going to go through all of them, but just to highlight some of the main ideas. These recommendations are very strong. They talk about all forms of human mobility. They talk about international migration, about internal displacement, cross-border displacement. They talk about how states should formulate laws and policies and strategies to address the links between climate change and migration. They emphasize the importance of national policies to address climate migration, and the importance of connecting policy areas of policy coherence at the global level between climate change policy and migration policy. And in line with this policy coherence, the recommendations of the TFD emphasize a collaborative approach among the actors that I mentioned. If you remember the actors that I mentioned just earlier before, states, UN, civil society, academia, migrants. And while they emphasize this collaborative approach, they do single out the main role that UNFCCC and the parties to UNFCCC has, as well as the role of the United Nations system and, of course, of states. Now, one of the limitations, and maybe the main limitation of this recommendation, is that they do not elaborate on gender or human rights issues. With this, I wanted to give you a brief introduction into the topic of environmental migration and how it is perceived in climate change negotiations. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And if you do want more information, please visit the IOM Environmental Migration portal. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on social media. Thank you very much. And don't hesitate to ask any questions, or you can also email me later. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was very helpful, and I think that really set the tone to what we hope to discuss. Before we move on, I would like to encourage everyone in the audience to maybe do a couple of things. If you have any questions, do maybe drop them in the Q&A box. And if you have any other points that you would like to add and to contribute, whether if it's any activities that you in your capacity or your organization does on this topic, please do add that as well, and we'd like to take that up much further. Also, there is a section called handouts, which has a couple of the publications that we've done on internal migration specific to Sri Lanka. You could maybe have a look at that as well. So moving on to our second speaker, we have Mr. Dennis Mombauer. He's the Director of Research and Education here at SLYCAN Trust. And Dennis, ready whenever you are.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Let me try to share my presentation as well. Right. Okay, I hope this is visible. So I want to talk about the work that we as SLYCAN Trust are doing.
Sorry, Dennis.
Is that echo? Yeah.
Your presentation is not visible. Could you just maybe try sharing it once again?
Yeah, sure. I'm not perfectly familiar with this platform, but I will try to make it work. Yeah, but anyway, I'll just start talking while I do this. So I want to talk a bit about what we as SLYCAN Trust are doing in the field of human mobility in the context of climate change. So SLYCAN Trust is a civil society non-profit think tank, and we work on a number of issues related to climate change and sustainable development, and human mobility is one of those. And in this area, there are a number of countries we work in, a number of fields that we try to address. So one of these things would be basically to further the understanding that is there of human mobility in all its forms. So climate migration, environmental migration, displacement, climate immobility, also trapped populations, relocation. These different forms of human mobility in the context of climate change, and to build contribute to building an evidence base on how this looks actually in different countries. So one of the countries we work in is Sri Lanka. That's where we are based. But we also work in a number of countries in Africa and Asia, for example, in Niger and Ghana at the moment on this topic. So to try to understand how climate change impacts human mobility on the ground. And we do to do this, we conduct interviews and we have stakeholder consultations to get a picture of that. And we also analyze laws, policies, regulations, and processes that are there, and see what entry points there are to better integrate these topics. So I hope the presentation is visible. So climate change and human mobility connects to a number of different fields. I think Sinziana has already given a good overview of this. So it connects to climate processes, it connects to the NDCs, national adaptation plans, the WIM, and also to areas of development planning, of issues of like food security and food systems, of the agriculture sector. It connects to risk management, not only in the case of disasters, but more comprehensive climate risk management. it connects to policies and regulations that govern labor, migration, employment. It connects to the health sector by having migration can have a number of impacts, physical impacts and mental impacts on the health of migrants and also on families staying behind, on host communities. It can have an impact on child development, education, on the well-being of children, especially if one of their parents or family members are moving or if they're part of a migrant community. It has issues of social cohesion that are relevant on the family level, on the community level, and it also impacts the environment through resource use, use of ecosystem services. And then on the other hand, also resilience and adaptation measures can increase or can counteract certain migration drivers and can help populations stay in place and avoid migration as a maladaptive measure. So we have, to better understanding, we have done a number of webinars. These are the last 3 that we did. Actually more than that also, on this topic with experts from all around the world. And we are collecting the information we get from that to get a better understanding. And in addition to that, we of course do the research on the ground in different countries. So for example, in Sri Lanka, I will quickly go through this as a case study. I don't want to take up too much time because we want to have an interactive discussion today. But so quickly just to show the complexity of the topic, even if we're just looking at one country. So in Sri Lanka, there are different dimensions of human mobility. There's foreign employment, people moving abroad, mostly to the Middle East. There's permanent internal migration for a number of reasons, like family reasons, marriage, but also employment, of course. There's temporary displacement from disasters like floods or landslides. And there's also like a cyclical or seasonal economic migration where people move to from rural areas mostly to urban areas in agricultural off seasons or in drought seasons to have additional employment there. And in Sri Lanka, most of the population, 90%, lives in areas that are projected to become moderate to severe climate hotspots. And a lot of the population is already migrating around. 1 in 5 people is an inter-district migrant, 1 in 7 is an inter-province migrant. And Sri Lanka has the highest relative risk of being displaced by disasters in South Asia. Not the highest total risk, of course, because the population is relatively small, but relative to population size, it's the highest risk in South Asia. And also a lot of households and a lot of the economy in general receives foreign remittances. It's a big source of income also that mostly applies for foreign employment and the economic migration to urban areas. And this is a sort of overview of the different dynamics that are there. So on the left we have climate change, which causes different impacts, as Sinziana already explained, slow onset, sudden onset, events of different intensity and frequency. Disaster events can cause people to move and sometimes be unable to return. Sometimes they're also able to come back after disasters. It can also cause permanent internal migration if people move out of disaster-prone areas, or sometimes are relocated out of these areas. And then there are slow onset impacts, long-term impacts, impacts on livelihoods, for example in agriculture sector, of course, but also fisheries, livestock, and small businesses. And these might lead to, again, permanent migration, to cyclical migration, or to going abroad for foreign employment. And then, very important not to forget this, we also have parts of the community staying behind. In many cases, these are women and children and the elderly, or those with special needs, but also in other cases, it's a man staying behind. So that means that families are being split apart by parts of the family being in, for example, an urban area to work there, and other parts are staying back in the rural home area. It can also mean families moving as a whole. So what we did, for example, in 2018, 2019, we collected data in Trincomalee district, that's in the northeast of Sri Lanka. That's a dry zone district. And we collected data across 7 villages, and we found that most of the farmers predictably had experienced drought impacts and shift in rainfall patterns, 97%. And most of them also changes in annual rainfall amounts, in temperature increase, and also in water scarcity. And this has led to a very high rate of migration, what we found in that case study at least. Out of the families we surveyed, 80% had a family member who has moved away. And out of these, 72%, or not out of these, also total 100% we surveyed, 72% had a husband, the man of the family, moving away, 2% the wife, 4% sons, and 2% daughters. So in the vast majority of cases, it was men who moved away. That there's a number of reasons for that. I will not go into detail on this now, but the effect is that a lot of these areas now have families where the main income earner is missing, and women being facing like triple responsibilities of caring for the household, raising children, and then also trying to keep the agricultural operation going or earn additional income to provide for the family in case of remittances not being enough. And the main reason for that is drought. Was named as the main reason by 84% of the survey respondents for their economic troubles and also for the migration. And destination is in many cases Colombo, other cases Kandy, Vaunia. So cities, vast majority goes to Colombo, the biggest city, capital of Sri Lanka. Others go to other larger cities. Very few go to smaller areas. And out of those staying behind, 2/3 had financial problems. They don't have a proper source of income. And additional impacts were reported on education, on nutrition, on child development, the issues with stunting and wasting among the children, issues of physical and mental health, of also the elderly who are forced to or put in a position to take care of children and households where they might themselves have issues of health, issues of social cohesion, and also reduced efficiency of traditional risk-sharing mechanisms and ecosystem services. And we can see here that here are some of the livelihoods that people have tried to adopt, home gardening, for example. But again, since there's a lack of water and issues with drought, for many it's not possible to do this because they don't have a well or the well is far away. And that means they cannot do the home gardening that they could do otherwise as an income source. So that also means there's a huge potential to address these issues and help people through adaptation measures, through risk management, and through development interventions to reduce this migration drive and to allow them to stay in place and adapt to the climate change impacts. For example, by distributing water, restoring the tank systems that are there, and by employing different agricultural techniques, different crop varieties, different livestock breeds. If you want to have a closer look at this, since I cannot go into detail in this now, we have published this case study on Trincomalee district, and it's also available, I think, in the handout section of this. So if you click on the right side, I think our team has put it there. This details the case study that we did there, the survey. We also have a policy brief on the policies, the laws, and process that connect to human mobility in Sri Lanka. So going in a summarized form in this through all the relevant policies in the disaster management sector, climate change area, in development policies, and also risk management policies and acts and laws. And also how it connects to the Warsaw International Mechanism and to the NDCs and how it's integrated into the NDCs of Sri Lanka. And our newest publication is a working paper on highlighting certain sectors that we got input from to a workshop that we conducted together with IOM Sri Lanka. And we had a number of ministries there, a number of UN agencies, a number of other main stakeholders. And this focuses on the sectors of water resources and irrigation, on human health, on ecosystems and biodiversity, and also on risk management. So, and also on issues of gender and vulnerable communities and how they are integrated into what is there in migration governance. So with this, I think I would stop. You can find more information on this also on our knowledge hub that we have, the Adaptation Resilience Knowledge Hub. And I'm very happy to answer all questions that you might have. I think what we are trying to do today is to get a more interactive discussion and share experiences across different countries and different organizations. So I would give it back to Sinasha, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Dennis, for your presentation. So once again, I'd like to encourage anyone who'd like to drop me questions, to do so in the Q&A section. And also, if you would like to maybe talk about anything that you're doing on your end or your organization, then please do raise your hand and we should be able to allow you to speak. Prior to that, we have our final presentation by Executive Director Ms. Vositha Wijenayake. Vositha.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me. Yes. No, you can't hear me? Great, okay. Thank you. So I'm not going to have a presentation because I think a lot of information has been shared by the two previous speakers. I wanted to just highlight a few things that could lead to the discussion session on how the UNFCCC process connects with the human mobility thematic area. So as obviously the speakers have highlighted, we have under the UNFCCC, there was an international mechanism and the task force on displacement. And through the years since, I guess, 2013 on, we have been focusing on aspects related to loss and damage. So here we have certain progresses that have happened where human mobility is seen as a concept of issues related to loss and damage and how we could address it under the WIM and the EXCOM, Executive Committee that provides advice on this, and then how it connects with the negotiation process. So basically, the UNFCCC mandates, the COP mandates the WIM, and then through that, the task force is established, and then the recommendations are made by the task force that goes through the WIM and report back to the UNFCCC and the COP. So some of us as stakeholders in this process work on this. Some of the civil society organizations and even IOM is a member of the task force, if I'm not mistaken. And how can we effectively ensure that the work that happens through the task force in the UNFCCC process is inclusive, and also that the evidence-based actions are facilitated through what we engage in these activities is something we can look at as well. And then another thing I want to highlight before we go into the discussion was how human mobility could be an aspect of the nationally determined contributions that we focus on. So some countries are focusing on human mobility as a concept related to climate change, and then some are seeing it as a thing to focus on under loss and damage, but some have this brought under the adaptation actions as well, like Dennis highlighted. So there's agriculture sector, water sector, and then potentially other sectors which would have aspects where migration and displacement happens. So how would this play a role in the review process of the NDCs? How can human mobility be integrated into the new NDCs of countries, whereby you could have national plans and policies highlighting climate-induced human mobility? And then the other one we could focus on is national adaptation plans, because in the previous presentation, we had this element of human mobility being seen as a problem or a solution. So if you're looking at adaptation and resilience building or sustaining resilience of communities to address climate impacts, is migration or mobility a solution? If so, how can it be planned and implemented in a manner that people are not forced to do it, but it could facilitate building resilience? So in work that we do on national adaptation plans and profile building, we've worked across Asia and Africa in these topics. When we're doing the country profiles, we have looked at how policies and plans in these countries focus on human mobility, and also how human mobility or displacement or migration, or in the case of transboundary migration, how some of these migrants or refugees who come into countries could play a role in exacerbating the impacts of migration on resources. So we have some countries like Uganda, which could be a focus for this purpose, how the refugees who are moving could be also having a component of climate impacts, having a decision impact that can be highlighted through even case studies. Some of these were highlighted through our webinar. So how can we look at them in a holistic perspective is something we can discuss as well. In addition to that, we're talking about stakeholders. So there's women, there's youth, and the vulnerable communities. how are these groups focused under the UNFCCC process, and how that could also be a way to look at human mobility is something, as well as capacity building. Because as Dennis mentioned, a lot of migrants have lack certain skills to adapt to the impact. So for example, if it's a farmer who's impacted by climate impact, floods that impact their livelihoods, when they're moving into different professions or unskilled labor, they are at a risk, and their resilience level is much lower than someone who has a skill set to adapt. So the adaptive capacity would be lesser based on the livelihood skills that are there, as well as the capacity building that's available. So under the capacity building components, we can look at this as well as action for climate empowerment, how youth, as well as gender component, how the gender action plan could potentially look at this in terms of certain vulnerabilities that would be there among youth and women more than other parts or other groups of community who are impacted by climate-induced migration. Then we also can look at, in terms of just transition, the concept of bringing in the skills, the capacity building, and also ensuring access to certain resources in an equitable manner to all communities who might be migrants or those who might potentially be at threat of displacement due to climate change. So this was just an overview I wanted to lay out. We can always look at these aspects and even more. You probably have a lot of case studies, experiences, or other aspects that you have worked on which relate to what we're discussing. We can look at how civil society could play a role in bringing this together, how we can potentially look at knowledge sharing and also contributing to technical expertise, how civil society could be more involved in the UNFCCC process related to climate mobility, how we can advocate at national and international level to focus on this topic, as well as how the existing processes like NDC, NAP process, as well as action for climate empowerment and agenda action plan could potentially play a role in scaling up activities on climate-induced migration and displacement. So I will stop at that and pass the mic to Sinziana, and over to you for further inputs on this.
Thanks, Vositha, for that presentation. And I would like to kindly request all speakers to maybe turn on their cameras on, so we have everyone. Yeah, great. So we do have a question already, but maybe while a few more questions come in, I have a few questions that I'd like to ask all of the panelists. Anyone could answer. So maybe one of the first questions I would like to ask is, and also I know that we have a diverse audience here who's present, but maybe in terms of like Sri Lanka, South Asia, or I think Sinziana mentioned Bangladesh, in terms of local level stakeholders, especially institutions, who, I mean, Vositha did mention a couple of international stakeholders who work on this aspect, but in terms of local level stakeholders and institutions who would be who would rather have who would have this under their mandate, or like who would be interested, who would be working on this, and as CSOs or individuals, who do we approach to talk? The question is open to any.
I could add something, but I think Sinziana had this on one of her slides, so maybe she could elaborate.
No, please go ahead. I'll compliment this.
Okay, thank you. I think it depends. It's basically context-based, right? In certain countries, the ministries that would be in charge of activities related to migration and human mobility would be different. So we have to study how, at national level, which stakeholders in terms of the government entities would have to be engaged, but we would have to have the government involved in these processes. And then we have to have other stakeholders, such as civil society organizations, research organizations, and also migrants or those entities that respond to issues related to migration, and also those sectors that are most vulnerable. So if I take the case of countries like Niger and Sahel countries that we work in, there could be communities that are pastoral communities and also agricultural communities, and in Sri Lanka this is the same. So there are similar similar sectors that are impacted due to the dependence on environmental resources impacted by climate change. And then also policies and plans. So there needs to be a level of policy implementation, the entities that relate to it. And I would always say, like, all these stakeholders that we work with, maybe potentially private sector, also bringing them into the equation and seeing how they can contribute to the process. Because we are not talking a lot about them when we're talking about human mobility, but I guess like the other actions we take, we could look into the avenues of how they can play a role in contributing to address this issue as well.
Thanks, Vositha. Sinziana, would
Yes, thank you for that. I think that that's a very great example of how things can work. And what we see from the global level is that there are indeed multiple actors working on this. I think the main actors, of course, are states and migrants. And then we look at the organizations that work to support these two entities, right? Who can support states to build capacity, to implement things on the ground, who can support migrants to build resilience, to develop their own kind of adaptive capacity as well. So when we look at the specific actors, an interesting point and something that we always try to do from IOM is to bring all these actors together. So as Vositha was saying about the different ministries, this is one of the, let's say not challenge, but maybe something that we're working on to bring the Ministry of Environment together with the Ministry of Migration, for example. It's quite rare that they talk together about how to address environmental migration or how to address climate migration, how to prepare for this type of movement in the future. So that's one example. Then we look also at different levels, at regional level. We know that the regional level is one of the most important levels in order to be able to address population movement in the context of climate change and the environment. This is where a lot of things converge. The interest in the topic, the way that countries are affected by migration, the way that countries are affected by climate change. We know that climate change doesn't see any borders, so there's quite similar concerns. So looking at the regional bodies, such as, for example, ASEAN in Asia Pacific, or the Economic Commission for West African States, ECOWAS, or the African Union, or CELAC, and so on for other regions. So looking at these multilateral regional bodies where states converge their interests and their issues, it's quite interesting as well. And this is where we've seen quite a lot of results on advancing policy, preparedness, actions, solutions for environmental migration. And then I think the national actors were quite well mentioned by Vositha, so I will not insist on that. But of course, there's a real importance of grassroots initiatives and, driving things from bottom up as well, not just, from top down. So that's something that we're very much aware of and trying to work together with NGO coalitions or different advisory groups. For example, in the context of UNFCCC, there is an advisory group on human mobility and climate change. There's a CSO coalition for this topic. So very much this approach is necessary, and it brings the core of the issues to the reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Dennis, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I don't think there's much more to add to what Vositha and Sinziana already said. I think most of the things are covered, and I very much agree that it's also very important to make these connections between different stakeholders on all levels. When I just think of the local or national level, there are different ministries involved, and some of them are obvious, but some might not be that obvious. So, for example, like climate change or environment ministry, and maybe the health ministry, and like whoever's in charge of risk management, they might be obvious in labor ministry. But then there are other ministries, like, for example, the one that's in charge of urban development that might be involved, ones that are in charge of irrigation or in charge of like rural infrastructure. So I think to bring all these together and connect them also to non-state actors, non-government actors, and especially also to community actors is quite important, and also to involve all those in the data collection. So to address these issues, I think we need evidence, and to need to collect it. It's very important to get it from the community level as well. So to involve communities and community organizations like farmer associations or women's groups or other community groups in the data collection and get more input from the ground on things that might not be there in formal data collection. For example, these seasonal migration patterns from in agricultural off-seasons might not be tracked in like official migration statistics because they are not really officially changing their residence. They're just moving for like 3 months at a time, 4 months at a time, and then coming back. But there's still a movement going on, and to track that, I think community and CSO involvement in the data collection would also be essential. And that's also, I think, where academia can play a role. And then the private sector, as Vositha mentioned. And I think to connect all these actors would be very important to get a comprehensive picture and also then, based on that, address issues related to migration.
Thank you. We do have a question from someone in the audience on the panelists. I think lost Sinziana temporarily. She'll be back. So the question is on what are the ways to quantify the impacts of slow onset events on human mobility? Is it possible to address certain vulnerabilities by quantifying such impacts? So Vositha, maybe you could go first, Dennis, and then Sinziana.
Right. It's an interesting question. So I guess if it's on the UNFCCC process, there is an expert group set up to work on this. So looking at the work that's happening under the group as well as the and then seeing alignments on how the task force on displacement could connect and build certain solutions to work on slow onset and the impacts of it would be something we could look at. But I don't think this is the easiest thing to do. So I am not an expert on quantifying slow onset impacts. So I don't know whether my answers would have to be taken in the terminology that I'm saying this. But I feel like capacity building and understanding of the impacts is one that we need to look at. And then also a bit more focus on slow onset impacts themselves is the starting point to do this activity. I could give an example of how we've done with certain hazards in Sri Lanka, looking at mapping the recorded impacts from hazards and then seeing where migration has been there. So for example, we've looked at how labor employment from Sri Lanka to Kuwait has been, and then looking at certain elements of slow onset and hazard impacts which have been recorded to see whether these have been indirectly impacting the wave of migration for employment. Though some of the people did not say directly when requested information, okay, what led you to go saying, okay, this is the climate impact, but then there were certain elements like, okay, there was a landslide happened, there was a drought, there was precipitation that impacted us, and then that had an impact on our livelihoods, which made us have to move because we couldn't afford to build back our house or afford our living. So these are things that were indirectly highlighted, but closely calculated, not so much. So this could be an activity on for our research team to do, I guess, to see how this could happen. But I'm very, very welcoming to hearing what you've done on this topic so that we can also potentially include some of your work and experiences in the work that we could do building on the aspects that you have mentioned in the question. Over to you, to the other speakers, if they could provide more information on this.
Thank you for the question. I think this is an interesting question on slow onset events and human mobility. And I would recommend perhaps to read one of the this month under the UNFCCC. This research piece, hello? This research piece focuses exactly on the state of the knowledge on slow onset events and human mobility. And I think there's quite a few interesting pieces of research that are mentioned there. There's a lot of research going on this and how to better quantify the impact, but also how to make the link stronger. So I'll share the link in the chat, and I would recommend to read that. Difficult to quantify this, and the IPCC has been trying to quantify this relationship since its incipient reports. So the last report of 1.5 degrees of IPCC talks about this relationship. I can put the quote in the chat afterwards, but I would encourage you to read through an analysis of the IPCC reports as well as it relates to human mobility. Thank you.
Thanks, Sinziana.
Yeah, I think on a very concrete level, like on a national or even subnational level, I think it's possible to probably quantify these. What is needed would be a good understanding of what we are trying to quantify, what we classify as slow onset events. And then I think data collection again would need to involve different actors. I think indicators would need to be developed for the environmental aspects of these slow onset events. I don't know, salinity in the soil or whichever indicator and slow onset event you want to pick, and then probably livelihood impacts as well and social impacts. And if it's possible to develop indicators for that and collect data over an extended period of time, I think we can quantify these impacts as well, and based on that, address them. The issue, of course, is since these are slow onset events, it will take a while to really build to have a baseline and then build based on that an understanding of how the changes are. So, it's not my area of expertise. I would imagine something like that is definitely doable and should be done. How to pick the indicators would again be based, I think, on a scoping and consultations with the key entities and also the communities to understand what kind of impacts they're experiencing and what needs to be tracked to address them, what the vulnerabilities are that are connected to these.
Thanks, Dennis. We also have another question on bringing in youth into the discussions by Suramya. So Suramya says, how can youth engage in the human mobility process? So I believe what she would want to say is, how do we get them to also, when we talk about it, or maybe build, generate awareness on this? I wonder, we do have some work that we've done here at SLYCAN Trust, maybe Vositha and Dennis could also explain it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, youth would be a key group to focus on because they have a tendency to migrate if they are facing hardships due to environmental impacts, as well as they could be a group that's highly impacted because their education could be impacted, the livelihood options would be impacted. So engaging them in finding solutions is highly important. At SLYCAN Trust, the work that we do for capacity building youth are a key group that we focus on, and then we try to engage them in finding solutions, implementing projects, addressing these different sectors that are highly vulnerable to climate change, and also skill development for taking up different livelihoods or enhancing the existing ones by building resilience. So we have a program called Global Forum on Climate Change, Global Youth Forum on Climate Change. So we've been doing this at national level since 2016, and then we've scaled it up to a global one now. And then we are engaging youth across the world this year and providing technical support to implement projects, as well as support implementing actions where possible through financial support or through organizations that could contribute to working with them in country. And there is a youth coalition on loss and damage that's been working very actively recently as well. Some of them have engaged with us in our capacity building work, sharing their work and the focus that they have on migration and other areas on loss and damage. So that could be a starting point if youth are interested in engaging and network working on this topic as well. So over to you. Anyone else would like to add?
Thanks for the question on youth. I think this is a very good question. IOM has been trying to engaging with youth for quite a long time now. We had a year or two ago, I think, an international migration dialogue focusing specifically on youth, and in that context, we also had a session dedicated to migration, environment, climate change, and the role of youth in this. So I'll also send the links to those references. But just to echo what Vositha said, in the context of UNFCCC, there is quite a strong youth engagement, particularly in the task force on displacement, which makes the link between climate change and migration. There is the UNFCCC NGO constituency group on youth NGOs. So I guess youth NGOs can join this coalition in order to contribute to the work on migration and climate change under the UNFCCC. And then there's a second facet to it as well, addressing the issues related to children and youth on the move because of climate change or affected by climate migration. And this is something that IOM is working on with UNICEF, for example, and other stakeholders as well, to look at some of the impacts, the vulnerabilities around these issues as well. And I think it would be fantastic if youth coalitions could look at these specific issues as well. Thank you. I'll share the link.
Thanks, Sinziana. Dennis?
Yes. So I think a lot of what Vositha already mentioned, the Global Youth Forum on Climate Change is what we do. We also try to have a youth component in our research and capacity building and awareness creation. So, for example, we have a project on climate risk management and risk transfer, where we go to farming communities, and we do have group meetings and workshops with youth and try to get a better understanding of their issues related to climate change, but also to build their capacities on how to deal with this and how to address this. And that is often interesting. Like in some cases, for example, it turns out that many of them already have having small businesses. They're trying to have additional livelihoods in areas where usually farming is the main livelihood. And then it's also you get to know what kind of support they would need to enhance this, to upscale this, and to further improve this. So I mean, the question is, how can youth engage in the mobility processes? I think what is what needs to be answered is also how can we facilitate youth to engage in them, and how can platforms be opened and forms be opened for youth participation and youth input, and also have youth be a part of decision-making processes and integrate their input into policies. Because often policies are developed just with the main stakeholders in ministries and maybe a few UN or civil society entities. But to have this broader input from youth and from communities and from stakeholders of different areas, I think would be very important to have actually to address issues that are related to mobility and youth specifically. And I think there are a lot of those, because often, as Vositha said, youth are the ones migrating. In other cases, they are the ones ending up in areas, stuck in areas where they might not have any livelihoods left because people have migrated out of these areas. And I think both for internal and international migration, this needs to be addressed. So I think one way would be to create ways for them to engage and to open up forums for youth to engage in the processes, which is also what we are trying with the the Global Youth Forum on Climate Change, and also the other capacity building workshops and awareness workshops that we're doing.
Thanks very much. While others would like to type in their questions, I'd like to maybe open up an area that would be nice to maybe discuss. I'm not sure if there's a particular answer for this, and those in the audience too could maybe contribute. But in terms of migration, is there, apart from the field level data collection that we do, how does one differentiate? I think at the beginning of Sinziana's presentation, she spoke of the different types of migration. So what is the more differentiating factor for, say, climate-induced migration, or say migration for economic for better economic prospects, so if that makes sense. So any one of the audience members or speakers could speak on this. But
maybe I'll go first. I have the easy answer. It's that it's very hard, and I think you put your finger on the very good question. It's very hard to make the difference, and we need to understand what is our purpose for making the difference. Are we actually helping people by making their difference, or it doesn't really matter, so we need to help people anyway? So that's an internal discussion we have in IOM as well, because we're trying to push our teams that work on data collection, data analysis, and so on to identify those 3 people out of the 10 people that are climate and that are not labor migrants and there are not children on the move, there are not so I think at a policy level, it makes perfect sense to make the difference. I think this is where we need to be aware of the different drivers of migration. We need to be aware that climate change has an impact on migration, on population movements as well. Then at operational level, this is where I think the importance of the difference between the drivers of migration are less pertinent, I would say, because we look at IOM's operations in the context of disasters, sudden onset disasters like humanitarian aid. We don't necessarily look at, why you are moving and why you're not moving. We need to deliver humanitarian aid. We need to deliver shelter. We need to deliver wash assistance. We need to deliver protection assistance and so on. So I think there's this kind of level. So in terms of actually gathering the data, what we're trying to do in IOM is to gather data with different purposes. One is a purpose for policy making, awareness raising, sensitizing, making sure that this is on the agenda of states, that they are prepared for this kind of movements, this kind of impacts of climate change. And then there's another data collection effort specifically for operations. This is where we look at the profiles of people moving, what are their needs, what are their protection needs, and so on. So when we're collecting data for policy reasons, this is where we try to, estimate, okay, given the climate change impact in this area, this is what we can think about the people moving. I think looking at the current population movement is harder. I think perhaps what has worked better so far is projections on this topic. We've seen the World Bank making projections on climate migration, saying that by 2050 there will be over 140 million people on the move because of climate change in only 3 regions in the world. So I think there it's somehow more adequate to look at projections. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Seni, for the question, and I think it's a very important question to ask. Also, as Sinziana pointed out, I think it's very important to ask, why do we want to classify something as like climate migration or environmental migration? So usually we broadly speak on like human mobility in the context of climate change, but I think so if you go to a farmer and ask them like why did they migrate, usually the answer is because they didn't have water to cultivate if there's a drought, for example, and the answer will not be because they don't have money. And the answer will not be because of climate change. But climate change, of course, plays a part in how this drought became, in how droughts became more intense and more common. But then, on the other hand, it's not just the drought that is there, it's also the vulnerabilities that are there, the sensitivities, the lack of coping capacities, of adaptive capacities that might have played a big role in that, and also of the economic background, the resources, education capacities, financial inclusion. So, for example, the reason for migration might be they didn't have money. The reason for that is that there was the cultivation was bad, the yield was bad because of lack of water. The reason for that might be that the tank has not been maintained properly. And the reason for that is because they didn't have the technical expertise and the money to do that. So I think it's important to follow these chains of causes and understand them. I don't think it's our main, on the ground level, the main concern that if it's climate migration or some other kind of distinct migration, but it is important to see how it can be incorporated in different policy areas. For example, into policies related to climate change, it's important to integrate it because it is connected to climate change. So then it is a good argument why it should be included in NDCs, in the National Adaptation Plan, in climate policies. But then it does need to be included into development policies as well, into economic plans and land use plans, into agricultural sectors. And I think it's a real challenge to connect all these things and to understand interconnections and not just say this is climate migration, so that needs to be addressed through climate processes, and that's it. So yeah, it's a very good question, Sinziana. Thank you very much, and it's difficult.
Sorry, just to comment, Sanasha, I think when we're looking at climate-induced migration, there is that version which is connected to potentially an agricultural practitioner or a farmer or someone, but there's also this large-scale conflict-based migration that happens, or we call refugees moving from one place to another. But in some cases, this could also be linked to some form of natural hazard or some impacts of climate change which aggravated or created a conflict. So we're looking at two spectrums of data here, and then looking at how it can be classified is as mentioned by Sinziana and Dennis. But I think it's not that this is only because of climate change, but it's maybe indirectly linked or influenced by, which leads to someone taking certain decisions to move or stay back and suffer, or their situation is made worse or resilience is decreased. So we need to understand, we need data to understand this. So if you're making adaptive and resilience building efforts or taking humanitarian actions or identifying these and making actions under loss and damage related climate impact activities, but we need to understand it. So data is important, while we need to, as agreed, to take all these factors in and identify the solutions. For example, development solutions, policy interventions, and also how people could be given solutions to the needs that they have when they're on the move as well, as Sinziana mentioned.
Thanks very much. And we have exactly about 7 minutes more before this session automatically ends. I would now like to maybe request all of the speakers to provide any closing remarks, if any, and also perhaps if you could bring in the aspect of COVID-19 into your opinion. You'd see, sorry, we just lost some speakers, but they're coming back. Right. How you see this playing out in the coming months to years. So maybe about 1.5 to 2 minutes. Sinziana, if you could maybe start, and Dennis.
Sure, thank you, and thank you again for this rich discussion and the interesting questions, and congratulations to the organizers for this event. A final word, perhaps, to say that it's specifically in the context of UNFCCC looking at COP26 this year with the leadership of UK and Italy. We're very much looking forward to see what are the next steps and how we can strengthen climate action that supports migration policy as well. So I would encourage us all to perhaps keep our focus on COP26 and see the importance of this for IOM. There are several things at stake, such as the conclusion of the second mandate of the task force on displacement and seeing the results of that, perhaps. And then perhaps a second word on COVID-19. IOM has been looking at the links between COVID-19, migration, and the environment, as there are quite a few. We see, for example, the movement restrictions, such as lockdowns or border closures that have had an impact on people moving in the context of disasters, context of climate change or environmental degradation. People have become trapped because they cannot flee disasters, when you have to flee for your safety, and the COVID-19 movement restrictions have prevented this. We also see people that are displaced, that are in evacuation centers can be more susceptible to diseases, including COVID-19. And we also see difficulties for people to return to their countries or to their communities of origin because they have lost their jobs and so on. And, if there is a disaster in that country, then that's problematic as well. We also see a second kind of impact from COVID-19. Beyond the movement restrictions from this, it's the effect it has on socioeconomic context. The long-term effects of the impacts of the pandemic, and here we see some of the rural households that are impacted by COVID-19 because they depend on seasonal migration. That means movement all the time, and on pastoralism, of course. So the agriculture sector has been really impacted by this because it relies on temporary labor as well. And also we see families and people that rely on migration as an adaptation or coping strategy in the face of climate change that have been impacted by COVID-19. And I've only highlighted the issues, of course, but just to say that IOM is looking at this, and if anyone is interested to explore these issues, we also have a call for submissions. We launched a blog series on the topic, so we invite you all to if you're interested to do some research on this, or if you have opinions or thoughts on this, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're very interested to hear more about this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Dennis and Vositha as speakers.
Okay, I will keep this brief. So on COVID-19, I don't think I'm the expert to talk about that, and I think Sinziana has already outlined some key considerations. In general, I would think it's, I would say as closing remarks, it's like two things. One, the importance of like connecting stakeholders and levels. So when we do work on the ground and collect data, what we want is that it also connects to the national level and the policy processes, and also to the international, the governmental level, to the UNFCCC process, to the WIM, to the Nairobi Work Program, to be able to feed into these processes, and then from there on come back to the ground level, and to connect these different processes on different levels is something that I think civil society actors like SLYCAN Trust can also play a big role in. So that would be the one thing, and then the other thing is to keep in mind that human mobility is has very different facets and aspects, and that it's not always a negative and not always a positive thing. That migration can be an adaptation strategy in itself as well, but it can also be. It depends on the circumstances, how it is, how voluntary it is, and the different elements involved. So I don't think we should see migration as something, or mobility as something that is always negative, that we try to avoid at all costs, but also not as something that we always want to encourage. So it's very important to get this evidence, to get this understanding of what we're looking at, and to then find ways to integrate this into policy processes, into international processes, into the process under the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, and from there on again into national policy processes. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay, so I try to word it in 60 seconds, so we keep the time. So I think whether migration is positive or negative is a question of what the people want to do, right? If it's forced, then it becomes an issue. But if you're voluntarily trying to build resilience and say this is a risk area, and then you need to move for your own good in the sense of having livelihoods, other factors that come into play, being available when they move, it's a different conversation we have. So with COVID-19, I believe we have the different ways to address this. So economic impacts that would have implications because of COVID-19 would add on to whatever existing factors that move people to migrate and displace themselves. So we need to look at how both can be addressed, the climate impact as well as economic impacts that come with COVID-19, plus other vulnerabilities that are there. So for example, if it's migrating or displaced women and children who might be vulnerable, the same could be because we are restricted in an area that you cannot move, you don't have access to health resources, or you are facing adverse impacts like domestic violence, which is seen, or harassment that is seen because of migration as well increases. So there are common things that have increased, not necessarily because you're migrating, but you're actually restricted in one place and cannot move. So we need to look at all these, and I think NDCs which are being done could be a way to look at both aspects, focusing on COVID-19 impacts, linking it with economic aspects, as well as how climate actions can be taken as well. We'd be very happy to discuss further with anyone who's interested, and some of the work that we do across the regions in Africa and Asia focus on profiling and developing policy analysis. So if any country, any organization would like to work with us, we'll be happy to lend our technical expertise where relevant as well. So I'll stop with that.
Thanks very much, Vositha, and thank you once again to Sinziana, Dennis, and Vositha for giving us your time and your expertise, and especially to the International Organization of Migration. Also, thank you to us, to our audience for submitting your questions and your participation, and as well as to Climate Action Network International for this initiative. We do have 2 more sessions that are coming up, one in about another hour and a half on protecting coastal and marine ecosystems for climate change mitigation and adaptation. You will be able to see that in the main stage. We also have another event tomorrow on just transitions in food systems, and in food systems rather, which is also around the same time, which is also available on the main stage. So thank you very much once again, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.